So Amazon Web Services has been a great supporter of Blackbird and the Sunrise, and they've been kind enough to sponsor a CTO panel today who are going to discuss why learning to code will make you a better founder. So Paul from AWS is going to moderate, and then we've got, as you can see from the slide, we've got Jessica Glenn, Pete Gatt, Alex North, and Anton, who is ex-Atlassian, who are going to be on the panel. So I'd like to bring Paul up in the panel, please. Thanks, John. Hey, Alex. How are you? Hey, guys. Anton, how's it going?
Well, welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us for our CTO panel this afternoon. We've got 4 of Australia's best CTOs and co-founders with us on the panel here with Jess, Pete, Anton, and Alex. And in the next 30 minutes or so, we're going to explore the topic of why learning to code will make your startup more successful. I'm Paul Migliorini, and I lead the Amazon Web Services team here in ANZ, and we absolutely love startups, where creativity, energy, enthusiasm, and a passion for changing the world come together to form great businesses. Everyone benefits. And startups for us at AWS have been a really important part of our business in the last 10 or so years since we formed. We've been really privileged to work with many of the world's great startups, companies like Netflix, Atlassian, Airbnb, Stripe, and many, many more. And startups have played a hugely important role in the development of our business. 95% of the new features and services that we launch come directly from customer requests. And startups, we find and have found over the last 10 years, really pivot hard on technology and are really pushing us hard to develop really aggressive new features continuously over the life cycle of our business. So it's such a privilege to work with startups and have such a great panel here today. So Jess, why don't we start with you? You're currently the CTO at OneShift and Skilled, and you're doing some really incredible work. On your LinkedIn profile, you call yourself a code-slinging, deal-making co-founder who got her start flipping curly-whirlies in the tuck shop, working in property and banking before finally learning to close her curly brackets properly and prompting her to leave her real job for the last time. So Jeff, coding's obviously played a really big role in your life. How did you get started, and how do you think about the role that coding and technology plays in successful startups?
How did I learn to code? So I apologize, everyone. I was a banker. I'm trying to make amends. When I was working at a bank, someone came to me for what was essentially a marketing app. And they came with this quote, and there's a thing called a bank quote where you figure out how much it should cost and then you add a zero, right? The quote came out at $300,000 to build what just seemed like a perfectly logical, simple piece of software. Now I'm stubborn and I suffer from a bit of hubris. And I was about to board a large flight, or a long-haul flight. So I downloaded the documentation for Objective-C, and I downloaded Xcode while I was at the airport lounge. And then I spent the next 17 hours making a lot of mistakes and came off with this clunky prototype. I went, well, that wasn't really that hard. And then I got addicted. Anyone that doesn't code in the audience, be careful. The moment you start to learn that you can fix things really easily is the moment you start to get hooked. So about 6 months later, I no longer worked for the bank, and I went into a virtual reality and augmented reality startup. Took some money off the table in there. Didn't know much about startups, so didn't realize that that was actually rare. So went into another one, failed absolutely dismally, like crashed so bad, put lots of my own money in, and then it didn't work. So I made the fundamental mistake of going, you know what, that didn't work, let's throw some more and see what happens. Came out of that one, battered and bruised a little bit, which was quite good for me. Went and worked for a startup that eventually went to IPO in the middle of last year, which was quite nice. That was an experience I'd never had before. Came out of that, was doing another one, was starting to get traction when Jen George took me for coffee one morning and said, yeah, you're not leaving Sydney again. And that Thursday, I ended up moving up here and starting to work for her, which was a new experience.
Very good. Pete, you've played a big role in the tech community here in Sydney. You've co-founded Harva, which is a Blackbird founded startup. You've also co-founded Vibrato. You do a lot of work in terms of DevOps. What advice would you give to a founder who's got an MVP, is in a position where they're ready for that MVP to scale and is starting to think about how to deploy technology to make that outcome work?
Yeah, look, I think it's interesting. There's probably a couple of ways to look at it. I think if you've actually got a technology company, it's as in you're building something very technical, you're doing tech, then it's important to really do it from ground up, as you're actually even doing the MVP. So before you get to that stage, if you can automate and not put off, anything in the automation space until later on, it's very important. We have a lot of people though who come to us who've got to MVP stage. And again, it's a little bit interesting. Some people will get there with their architectures, and it's always around what they've done with, sort of automation and infrastructure. And we have some groups that we work with who will just actually throw that away. So they look at what they're actually doing and they're going, that's great. Not throw away the code and all that sort of stuff, but the infrastructure as code, if there was anything there, they'll normally look at that and do something different. But really what we actually normally do is look at things like trying to look at auto-scaling groups. So one of the big things is trying to make sure that the product will scale. There's containerization, and really, if you can, we were just talking about it backstage before, get to Lambda as soon as you can and just have no servers. But really, if you're at the MVP stage, I think the critical thing is just to make sure you look at the demands and what everyone's going to be looking at product-wise, and make sure you're going to be able to scale it.
Excellent. And you've said that your sole mission is to automate yourself out of a job. In terms of thinking about automation, what advice would you give the founders in the room in terms of automation, whether they need to be thinking about that right up front or it evolves as the startup forms?
I think it's something that I've applied to, I would say, all parts of my life. Probably not within my marriage, but everywhere else. My wife might say otherwise, but basically, whether it be with coding, whether it be with the infrastructure as code, or even the processes that you actually have inside of your company, if you can automate them, then basically that generally means you've got more time to focus on something that you want to focus on or that the business needs you to focus on. That's been a key part of my entire life. If I have to do something twice, it just pisses me off. It upsets me. And so, I'll do my best to automate it so I can get onto the fun things.
Excellent. Anton, you've been a part of a number of pretty special startups, Atlassian, more recently Safety Culture, and you're now at Iris. And I'm going to embarrass you a little here by quoting a quote from Scott Farquhar, who said that Anton was one of the earliest employees at Atlassian and has had the biggest influence on Atlassian of any employee, which is a pretty big statement from Scott. If you think about your career in technology and coding, how did you sort of come to get into that career, and what do you see the role of technology in forming successful startups?
Well, I guess I got into computers when I was very, very young. I loved games, and I wanted to build a game. And then I tried to get a job building games, and I couldn't. So I got a job building other fun stuff. I guess from where it's all going, I actually think that the technology industry is probably the only industry that's really going to exist, in 20 years' time, let's just say. So I believe that anybody needs to code, right? I mean, you've got people like Bill Gates saying it out there, saying that everyone needs to code. I'm fully supportive of that.
Great, thank you. And finally, Alex, by way of introduction, you're currently at Desert Labs. You've previously worked at Google, Posse and Canva. And you've got a somewhat cryptic entry on your LinkedIn profile at the moment, but you're essentially looking at trying to solve one of the hardest problems in AI and NLP. Mm-hmm. How did you come to get started, and how do you think about the role that coding and technology plays in successful startups?
So I came to become a software engineer the traditional way of randomly picking it when I went to university and then discovering that I lucked out and picked right. I had a fantastic university career, and by the end was very confident that solving problems with software was a thing that I could do that would help lots of people. I now, as everyone is probably aware, there's a rather drastic shortage of people who made the same random pick that I made 10 years ago, and I spend quite some time thinking about what we should be applying the limited supply of engineers to. And so that's part of what's led to my current venture, where it's solving a problem that I think is very important to the world. And so the engineering talent is a great constraint at the moment, which is sad. And I apologize, because partly it's software engineers who've built our own tools that no one else knows how to use, which I apologize for. But so I think it's very sad that it's necessary for you to have software engineers involved in just figuring out if your business is a good idea often. And I'm really excited about different ways for people to learn that without having to pay someone technical. But obviously, once it comes time to solve a difficult problem or solve it at some scale, that's where I'm really happy that we have a good crowd of people in Australia and around the world who do know how to build those things and create that kind of leverage.
So if we change tack a little bit and think about skills, in particular the skills shortage, engineering skills shortage in particular, what are some of the things you think we can be doing differently here in Australia to encourage people to take up STEM type disciplines earlier in their school lives and through university?
I definitely think it is, that was for me, I definitely think it is valuable to introduce as many people as possible to the scientific and engineering approaches early on in school. But that doesn't mean that I think everyone should become an engineer. And in fact, I don't think everyone should learn to code. People have different natural abilities, and I think discovering what yours are and then using them to the best of your ability and then joining forces with other people who have complementary abilities is the best thing that Australia or any group of people could do. But so it's critical that I think we expose more people to them early so that we can discover those people who will have these natural talents or this natural affinity can discover it as early as possible and learn that they can be part of great things that way. But after that, after that early discovery, I don't think we should be forcing people into those careers just because there's a shortage right now. I'm sure this shortage will continue for a decade or so, but it's very hard to predict what the state of technology will be 10 years from now. And whether or not I'm still as relevant as I am now is an open question.
Indeed. And Jess, do you have a view on how we can encourage more people to take up engineering earlier?
Yeah, okay, so there's a couple of things that we do really well at the moment that I think we could probably lean into. And I'll give a couple of shout outs. The guys that have us here today, Blackbird, fund some teams for first robotics competition. I was lucky enough to go and judge that earlier this year, and it was just a phenomenal experience. They're kids from about 14 to 18 in high school who build a robot to compete. And I got to speak to a lot of them, and the number one question I'd ask is, if this wasn't here, would you have ever imagined yourself building a robot or building a piece of software? And the answer was absolutely not, never. So I think more programs like that, or Google, who are doing a lot of outreach into regional and remote schools to try and make sure that they have the tools and the curriculum to start to learn how to code early. Not everyone needs to be a software engineer. I think we get that very wrong, but everyone should absolutely learn to code in some form. I am not an Excel whiz by any means. I know how to count if, and that's only because I spent time in a bank. Outside of that, I handball it. But I do know the basics, right? And that's where we need to get to with code, and we need to get there very quickly. Obviously, we are going to have a shortage. There are 20,000 jobs over the next year coming out and 4,000 graduates. So good time to be a coder.
Indeed. Anton, if you were a founder and you had no technical skills today, how would you be thinking about building that technical competency in your startup?
Probably go get some skills, to be honest.
Yeah. Do you think founders should be going and taking engineering courses and learning to code?
Look, I think it's very important to have an idea of what you're building. If you're actually building a company, you're building a startup that relies very heavily on technology, and I think at the moment a lot of startups will. I think it's very important to kind of have some insight about what's going on, especially at the beginning, because otherwise, I mean, the only other thing you can do is get somebody who is also, I guess, is seen as a founder of the business, who you absolutely trust, right? And if you don't have that absolute trust, I think it's going to be a bit difficult. But and in order to get that trust, I think actually spending some time learning how it all works. And I think, for example, Blue Chili is one of the accelerators that I think puts the founders through coding up a small feature or getting to the first point of their MVP. And I think that's incredibly useful. Just getting an idea about how hard it is. Because to get something to work, it looks amazingly simple, I think. But sometimes it's a bit, there's more behind the scenes. And that's good to get that feel.
So Pete, you've talked to me about instances where you've had startups that have come to you, they've had an MVP, and they've asked how they scale those MVPs, and they've effectively had to junk a lot of the work that they've done. If you could offer one piece of advice to a lot of those startups again, what would that piece of advice be?
Again, I think learning through the failures is going to be good anyway. So regardless, the company and the culture and the people around your organisation, learn through those things. I'll say at one point, even with Harvard, put my hand up and say I deleted the database at one point. And so I have no access to my own system anymore. So my co-founder has blocked me out. But really, no, I mean, that's not totally true. But the reason why we look at those things and those failures, it's really good. So we learned from that very quickly, and we learned at an early stage. And it's really good before we actually had real customers and everything else like that in the system. But if that hadn't have happened, that may have happened later on. So I'd say embrace the failures earlier on, as fast as you fail as many times as you can sooner, and then go and do things properly, right? But I think through the actual MVP stage, once you've gone through that, if I would look back and say something that I'd do differently, I think even myself personally, getting very deep into the code myself day one would have been really good. So I understand parts of the code, and obviously as the business grows, it's more difficult to keep a touchy-feely with everything. And but I think we did it relatively well. But I would have loved to have personally spent more time there, if possible. That's probably about it.
I have a piece of advice on that note for any founders out there. From a technical point of view, in a tech startup, if you don't throw out your MVP, you didn't code fast enough. Paul Graham has a really good line, right, where he says the only reason that startups ever fail is because they run out of money because they haven't learned to iterate fast enough. Your MVP is exactly that, is the minimum viable product to put in the hands of customers. You're going to go through it and iterate as many times as you can until you find a product where people will give you money. Right? As soon as you've gotten to that point, that's the point where you throw it out and go, wow, we should really do this properly now because this is a winner. But if you're spending the time making sure that your code hygiene is right and that your code is beautiful and that your database structure is right, you're spending time on the wrong things.
Totally agree. So we've got just a couple of minutes left. So just to close things off, what I might do is just extend Jess's point and ask the three remaining panellists. If you could offer founders one piece of advice in relation to technology in their startups, what would it be? Alex, perhaps we could start with you.
I would suggest trying to learn as much as you can without using technology. You can do an amazing amount with email and some spreadsheets without needing to write any code. There's a wonderful bias that Pete has of people who come with this MVP that's clunky and crappy, but they have some customers, and they're the ones that actually make it as far as seeing Pete. All the ones who wrote lots of beautiful code and don't have any customers never see him, and you don't want to be those ones.
Indeed. Pete.
I would say a few things. One, watch Silicon Valley. Two, definitely, definitely sort of the same sort of point is keep it simple, but keep it beautiful. So know that if you're not going to get a chance to come back and revisit it, then make sure that you've got the ability to be able to grow on it and scale it. And I had a third point, but I forgot.
Very good. Anton.
Does it have to be technical? Or?
No, it does not.
Make sure you pick a business you absolutely love. And if it's technical, put it on AWS.
Thank you. Well done. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in thanking our panellists.